Hello, everyone. Welcome to Let's Talk About History. This is the fourth event in our Indie Author Week celebrations. My name is Renee Edwards, and I'm the Program Director for Fairfax County Public Library. During this presentation, please make sure to turn off your videos and stay muted unless you are the speaker. We will have a Q&A session at the end of our author presentation, so please enter any questions or comments into the chat. This program will be recorded and available on the library's website. So you may be wondering, what are indie authors and why do we celebrate Indie Author Day? An indie author is someone who self-publishes to sell and who wants to reach as many readers as possible and grow a profitable author publishing business. So our annual Indie Author Day is a very special event for libraries and its readers because it allows us to meet and celebrate the achievements of our local and indie writers. This evening, we have a wonderful panel of authors to share their experiences as history writers. I would like to introduce Arthur Amchin, Caesar Rioso, Jim Johnston, Mary Lipsey, Ed Moser, and Denny Stokes. Welcome, and thank you all for being here. So let's start with our first question. Tell us about yourself. Who are you? We'll start with Arthur.
Well, thank you. I'm an attorney, administrative law judge by profession, and I'm still working actually. But I would say I've been an amateur historian since 1951, when my father took the trouble to explain to me what the 38th parallel was while listening to a newscast during the Korean War. The other relevant thing about who I am as it relates to my writing is that I was drafted into the US Army in 1969, and I spent 1 year in Vietnam, fortunately not in the field, and it led me to a fascination with wars that were very popular when they started and seemed to be very bad ideas after the fact. And that's what a number of my books are about.
All right, thank you. Caesar, tell us about yourself.
Hi, thank you. Well, let's see, I was born in Havana, Cuba, and my family came to the United States in 1965, and I've lived all over the place: New York, New Jersey, Florida, and most recently the last 18 years or so here in Virginia. Work as a digital producer at USA Today Sports, where I was baseball editor a while back. So I've been a journalist my entire career, and I've been just a huge fan of history, and in particular Cuban baseball history, and that's how I came to write the 2 books I wrote.
Thank you. All right, Jim, please tell us about yourself.
I'm also a lawyer. My practice was in telecommunications. I still do a little bit of it. But I want to say that I grew up in Independence, Missouri, and Harry Truman was president then. And I thought Independence, Missouri was actually I should call it Missouri. I thought Independence, Missouri was the center of the universe because people would drive down the street, and as a little boy, they'd stop and say, "Where's Mr. Truman's house?" So I think that gave me some interest in politics, government, and history. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mary, please tell us about yourself.
Hello, I'm Mary, and I grew up here in Fairfax County, so I went to Fairfax County schools, etc. My father was a historian and researcher for American Red Cross, and so I came about loving history through his influence. I remember living on near Arlington Boulevard, and we were dragged up to Arlington Boulevard to see Khrushchev drive by in a limo, and the Queen, not at the same time, obviously. But every time relatives came in the summertime, we spent our time going and looking at Mount Vernon, etc., with the relatives. So I come by my love of history naturally. I'm a retired American history teacher. I taught middle school American history at Lake Braddock. I also volunteer as a docent at the Smithsonian and the National Archives when they're open to the public.
All right, thank you. Ed, unfortunately, is having some difficulty and we won't be able to see him, so we'll just hear his voice. So, Ed, please tell us about yourself.
Yeah, since Halloween was last week, I decided to speak with a disembodied voice. And I'm originally from New York City, from the Bronx, and I have an unusual background. I've been both a presidential speechwriter and also a joke writer for the Tonight Show. And as I was speaking, they actually have similarities to them. It's sort of like sausage making, bringing together disparate materials and then presenting them to a national audience. I'm a tour guide in Washington, D.C., Lafayette Square, Old Town Alexandria, and I find inspiration from my tours to write books, history books about the held personalities and hidden events that have occurred in these historic areas. And I get feedback between my tours and my books going back and forth. The next one will be on Capitol Hill. The current one is on Lafayette Square.
All right, thank you. And Danny, please tell us about yourself.
Okay, well, I'm a native Northern Virginian, lifetime living here, except for 4 years in undergrad. Jen and I have been teachers our whole career, and as I said to our team here, I've spent my entire adult life with high school and collegiate age musicians, primarily as a high school band director, and now in retirement, running that same kind of organization. But I was at Fort Hunt High School, and I did 2+ decades at George C. Marshall High School, a decade plus at James W. Robinson Secondary School, and now we run in our 10th season now, Virginia Winds Academy. Our children are grown and gone and happy and married, and we have a granddaughter and a granddog.
A grand dog. How does that work? I've never heard that before.
Our son and his wife, they're both musicians, and they have a crazy dog. They live up in Sterling, and she's, yeah.
Oh, a grand dog.
Grand dog,
Okay.
yeah.
I felt like grandparent, I was trying to even visualize how that would work. All right, gotcha.
That would be complicated.
I can make things very complicated. All right, so tell us about your books and why did you decide to write about history? So we will start with Arthur.
Well, again, the fact that I was a draftee has a lot to do with my writing career. And particularly I've written, I think, 7 books, all nonfiction history. I started with the biography of Nelson Miles, a Civil War, Indian War, Spanish-American War figure, sort of went forward. But I've concentrated more recently on Vietnam and World War I. And I think, as I said before, those wars were very popular when we got into them. Everybody thought it was the right thing to do to intervene on the side of the Allies in 1917. There was a tremendous amount of disillusionment afterwards. So one of my books is entitled "Why Did America Fight?", trying to explain how the United States got involved in World War I. Another book, and I also the most recent book I wrote is called The Peaceniks, which is a biographical sketches of 7 U.S. senators who basically went against the tide, opposing the rush to war in World War I, Vietnam, and the Iraq War. Actually, with the Iraq War, I focused on late Paul Wellstone. Also, with Vietnam, I wrote a book called Killed in Action, which is sort of a biography of a guy who was drafted the same year that I was, named Stephen Warner, who was an anti-war activist in college, ended up going to Vietnam as a public information specialist and was killed. And about his experiences, which is a lot about the war, which was very popular in its early stages, and I think is conventionally regarded to have been a big mistake, which is also true of one of the reasons why we were hesitant to get involved on the side of the Allies. World War II is a great part of the American public thought that getting involved in World War I had been a tremendous mistake. And the other thing is, I think Americans know very little about why we got into World War I, which I think is one of the most consequential things that ever happened to this country.
All right, so I have to ask, why did America get involved with World War One? I'm one of the Americans who don't know.
Well, the conventional explanation is we got involved for protect freedom of the seas, but the real reason is that we invested in a victory by Great Britain. And there actually is a fairly decent argument from the German side. England threw up a blockade around Germany right at the beginning of the war, which we honored. So the Germans said, well, how come when we try to close off England from American shipping, you don't do anything about it? And that's when they resorted to, and that by desperation, they reverted to unrestricted submarine warfare to try to starve England out. But we had, I really do think, and one of my focuses, Senator LaFollette from Wisconsin, the most vocal opponent of American entry into World War I. And he said, it's all economics. We have invested, we say that we're neutral, but we're not neutral. We've invested in an English victory, and that's what this is all about. One quick thing, because I don't want to take up too much time. One of the most interesting people that I've written about is Senator George Norris from Nebraska, who was one of 6 US senators to vote against the war resolution 1917. A lot of his people like him also were against helping the Allies out in 1939, 1940. Norris, however, was one of the few people who was very adamant that Hitler was a totally different animal than the Kaiser. And he actually supported Lend-Lease and FDR's efforts to aid the Allies.
All right, thank you very much. All right, Caesar, please tell us about your books and why did you decide to write history books or books about history?
Well, for me, it began really as a kid when I would hear the stories that my dad told me. I was a baseball fan. My dad was a baseball fan back in Cuba, and he would tell me all these stories about American players who would come down and play in Cuba's Winter League. Famous guys who are famous now: Tommy Lasorda, Dick Williams, Monty Irvin, even Chuck Connors, who people recognize more as an actor. But he was a minor leaguer with the Dodgers farm system. So he told me about all these guys who would go down there and play. And when I finally became a sports writer for my career, I started finding some of these guys. They were retirees in Florida, and started doing stories about them, for newspaper articles. And I just knew that at one point I wanted to try to write a book, and I researched Cuban baseball history for many years. And out of that came the first book, Havana Hardball, which is about when in the 1940s, it talks about the Cuban League, one of its big finishes. And just as they were finishing up this great season, Jackie Robinson and the Dodgers arrive in Havana for spring training right before he broke the color barrier. So that's the first book. And my second book, Last Seasons in Havana, kind of picks up where the first book left off. In the 50s, professional baseball in Cuba is thriving, not only with the Cuban Winter League, but also they have a minor league team, the Havana Sugar Kings. And as these seasons are playing out, we have the overthrow of the government by Fulgencio Batista, and then the subsequent revolution by Castro. And that book talks about everything that happened during the revolution and what becomes of the Cuban League after the revolution.
All right, thank you. All right, Jim, please tell us about your books and why did you decide to write about history?
Thank you. I have 4 books. The first book was The Recollections of Margaret Loughborough. And this was a woman who was in Richmond during the Civil War. Her husband was a Confederate soldier, and she also was in Washington during the Civil War. So it's a woman's story, a Civil War story told through the eyes of a woman. The second book is called From Slave Ship to Harvard, Yarrow Mahmoud and the History of an African-American Family. Yarrow Mahmoud was a Fulani Muslim who was brought from Africa to Maryland on a slave ship in 1752. He rose to prominence in Georgetown and was painted by the great Charles Wilson Peale. And then I followed he was very famous in Georgetown. And then I followed his family for 5 generations until in 1927, one of them graduated from Harvard. And then my third book is Murder, Inc., the CIA under John F. Kennedy. It's about the CIA's attempts to kill Castro under John Kennedy's administration, and the relationship between those plots and Kennedy's own assassination. And in fact, at the very moment Kennedy was shot in Dallas, the CIA was finalizing its plot to kill Castro and meeting with a Cuban agent in Paris. And so these close ties with the two things. And then finally, I self-published a book on my father's experiences in World War I. As to why I like history, there are many reasons, but I was once talking to the National Presbyterian School, middle school students, and that's where Margaret Loughborough's house was, the big mansion was. And I was trying to explain to them, these 7th and 8th graders, why they should care about history. And I said, it's important to know in this particular book that these people walked the same ground you did, except 200 years ago. They had the same feelings that you have today. They have the same problems you have. And so by reading history, you can get a guide as to how you may or may not want to conduct your life. And so I think that's very important.
Thank you. Mary, please tell us about your books and why did you decide to write about history?
I have 2 books that have completely different topics. One is on aviation and the other is on women. The first one is Aviation from Curiosity to Reality, and it centers around early aviators. But one is aviator that I found is a local story. I literally stumbled on Dr. William Christmas, who in 1908 built and flew a plane in Fairfax Station. And he became the 3rd American to fly. Orville and Wilbur Wright were the first 2, and Dr. Christmas was the 3rd. And it's an absolutely fascinating story. He was well known in his lifetime. And then people haven't heard about him. So I've become like the poster child to get people to learn about Dr. Christmas. He worked alongside Samuel Langley in his aviation experiments. He knew Hap Arnold. And to think that it happened right in my own backyard in Fairfax Station at the same time when a newspaper in Clifton in 1908 wrote about the big deal was a car had been driven through Clifton. And I thought, but Dr. Christmas is out there flying in the same location. So I've really learned a lot about aviators and barnstormers and the first drones, et cetera. So that's what the From Curiosity to Reality focuses on, these men and women who are aviators. Then as a history teacher, I realized how little women's history is being taught. I was fascinated with the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, and went up to Seneca Falls and got inspired about all these women who wrote their own declaration of sentiments, they called it. And I started thinking about these women who were suffragists, but also all the others that went on and achieved so much for women. So the Almost Forgotten Women, Yesterday's Headliners is my other book, and it focuses on women between 1840 and 1940. And they had to have been in the newspaper. So that's why, I call them almost forgotten, but yet in their lifetime, they made headlines. And the versatility of these women were amazing. Many of them were suffragists, but the one that I just mentioned, Anna Coleman Lad, was an artist, and she was in France in World War I with her husband, and found that men who had been disfigured by flamethrowers or gas, whatever, in World War I, their faces were horribly disfigured. So she made cosmetic masks for these men to cover their faces, but worked on photographs with them to make sure that she could see what they looked like prior to making the mask. She did the skin tone. She even had real hair to put mustaches or whatever on it. And so Anna Coleman Lad was incredible as a woman that did this during World War I. So local history and women history have been my passion.
Thank you. Ed, please tell us about your books and why did you decide to write them?
Yes, I've written 14 books, and recently my specialty, my focus has been on the most historic areas in the Washington, D.C. area, and the most outrageous personalities and events that have occurred in these locales. Old Town Alexandria, Georgetown, Capitol Hill, and Lafayette Square, the subject of my book. To give you an example, just in one small portion of Lafayette Square, Jackson Place, you have the Decatur House, where a Navy Commodore died after a duel with a fellow naval Commodore after the War of 1812. A couple of doors down, you had lived a congressman who shot to death the son of Francis Scott Key, the author of the Star Spangled Banner, and then went off to, he actually beat the charges, the murder charges, and went off to be a hero at the Battle of Gettysburg. And then a couple of doors down from him, you have the Major Henry Rathbone, who was with Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater the night that Lincoln was assassinated and was wounded by John Wilkes Booth. And then right around the corner, you have the Blair Lee House, where there was an assassination attempt, the nearest assassination attempt close to the White House on Harry Truman in 1950. In the same place in 1861, Abraham Lincoln's had an aide who offered command of the Union Army to Robert E. Lee, the future Confederate general. So just in the space of a few yards, you have all these incredible events. And I thought if the rest of the Lafayette Square was like that, it would make a very gripping book. I think that turned out to be the case. And I've gotten another contract to do a similar book on the hidden secret history of Capitol Hill. To answer your question of why I like history, I've written books on science, medicine, politics, history, comedy, have a wide range of interests. And I find that history is the study of everything that happened until the moment that just passed. So that's why I love it.
Wow. Can you repeat that? History is the moment.
History is the study of everything in the universe up until the very moment that just passed.
Wow. That's so true. Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Ed. Denny, please tell us about your books and why did you decide to write books about history?
Well, it was interesting to listen to Ed because I told him before we got started here that my dad worked on Lafayette Square for 30 years. And I'm thrilled to follow Mary because everything she said about aviation is the perfect setup for my book. Of all the books I've written, the one that's been most successful is Letters to Dawn. It's the only book I've written. It was a matter of mission creep. To set the stage here, my father is Clint. That was his family name. The setting is World War II, and it's the European Theater of Operations. He was in 9th Air Force, Troop Carrier Command, the 316th. He's a pilot of a C-47, which was airborne assault, paratroops and cargo. As it turned out, a far more dangerous line of work than a lot of people realized at the time. So mission creep, at 1965, my dad had written 25 letters to his older brother, Don, letters to Don. And Don gave those letters back to my dad on the 20th anniversary of the end of World War II. Fast forward to 2016, and the letters are somewhere here in this office, and something came up in the conversation we were talking about, and I said, well, you know, letters might address that. And parenthetically, there is this larger than life story, this what I called again the outlandish excursion. There was, in all of the things that Clint wrote about and did in his deployment, there was this one event that just sounded almost like it must have been hyperbole, because certainly some lieutenant captain would have been involved in something like this, and in fact might have risked court-martial. So as I was going through these letters, I found a letter that described exactly as Clint had been, as my dad had been telling this story over the years, that was just outlandish, and there was no hyperbole at all. This is exactly what happened. So I figured I needed to organize these letters and at least type them up. So what started as a clerical activity morphed into a small Christmas present for close family. And then with others looking into it and saying, you know, there's more to be done here. And then there was research, and I was able to, there was no real context for these letters because with censorship and with the demure nature of most soldiers at that time, what they wrote tells you very, very little and nothing at all about the war effort itself or operations and piloting and so forth. So I just got going with this and basically ended up creating a parallel narrative of the same time. Clint's letters were the things that he could or would share with his family. And what I have been doing then was writing essays and explanatory remarks as we move through the letters chronologically. So that's when it really got exciting for me because I have more than a passing interest in World War II history and in aviation because of my dad. And the hidden story about my dad and my mom is buried to the end of this. So what I enjoyed doing was creating these essays that informed what was really going on when he was writing about. He seemed to always have a girl. I mean, you know, if he wasn't in the air, he was in either a bar or in a dance hall or something. And he was based in England until he was transferred to France and on beyond. But the letters themselves made more sense to me because I grew up, we cut wood together and I listened to his stories. And I don't think he told many other people them. There was a thing that George C. Marshall said about, and he was maybe the most important American in World War II, that sailors and their ships and pilots in their airplanes faced the possibility of a horrible death. But if they survived the day, they slept in their own bed. Whereas those in the field, the infantry and so forth, they didn't have to have lethal danger coming from across some line. Their life was just miserable in the first place. So people like my dad probably told more stories more freely than a lot of those who survived the maelstrom of World War II. So some of the essays, just, you know, going through what turned out to, you know, how it worked out. And this wasn't a plan. I looked at what the letters were about and kind of took it from there. So explanation and then a pilot training, the element of gratuity pay, which is what families got if the soldier did not come home. In my dad's case, it would have been about $900. About deploying to Europe by flying their own plane via Ascension Island and Africa and to England. This was in the last weeks before D-Day when they were building up all the forces as rapidly as possible. An essay on June 6th, what it was like to fly, and that was his first combat. In fact, the vast majority of Americans who deployed by ship or by air on June 6th was their first combat, although there were some units that had been in from the beginning, had been in Italy, had been in North Africa. So an essay on FUSAG, which is First United States Army Group, which was one of the most successful military ruses ever in history. And there's photos and the story of Patton being in command of it. And so in all of this, my dad's group was heavily involved in these operations. Cobra, when they broke out of the Cotentin Peninsula, they were flying the Red Ball Express. And I wrote about that, and that was maybe the most dangerous thing they did because they flew in with gasoline and jerry cans in these airplanes, landing on grass, supposed to be off the ground in 5 minutes. There's pictures in the book of the wounded soldiers lined up on litters, and then they are back into the plane. And then Market Garden, September 17. And there has been a recent book that's come out called September Hope by John McManus, who's a true historian. And there's more information about that, particularly the second day of that campaign, than the landmark book and movie, A Bridge Too Far. This is the same story, but it turns out that second day, C-47s took it in the teeth, and a lot of those that made it back to England were retired then. So it's just these essays happening as their deployment is there, and as they're lingering on knowing as time went on that the Pacific Theater might very well loom in their future. So it was just it was walking these two stories down the line, and I've enjoyed it. Some people have bought it, and that's my story.
All right, thank you for that. All right, I feel like some of you kind of touched on this. Where do you get your ideas? And I think for me, what I'm realizing as I listen to you all is that history is very broad. There are so many parts of history that somebody can focus on and write about, and that's your area of expertise. So I guess maybe a better question is, why write about aviation? Why write about World War I? Of all the things that you could have written about in history, why that particular subject? So you can answer that question, or you can tell us, where do you get your ideas? So we'll go back to the top of our list and turn it over to Arthur.
Well, I think the experience of being drafted into the Army has a lot to do with where I get my ideas about what I want to write about. This book I wrote about Stephen Warner, which is called Killed in Action, I actually went up to Gettysburg College. He actually had sent all his letters and things and notebooks that he took in the field were given to Gettysburg College, and he had intended to write a memoir about Vietnam himself, but he was killed in 1971. So in a way, I did it for him. The other thing I think about, ideas. In 1982, I was on the Harvard campus, and I walked through Memorial Hall, which has all these plaques commemorating the Harvard students who died in the service of the Union. And it kind of made me think, well, here was a group of college students who, volunteered to go to fight, whereas, 1969, when I was drafted, nobody was in a big hurry to go to Vietnam. And I think that sort of also focused my attention on warfare and the people who are in it, and also the people who are courageous enough to oppose the rush to war. People like La Follette, Norris, George McGovern, Wayne Morse. One interesting thing there is that a lot of these guys were maybe not all that likable, other than their courageous stand. I think Senator La Follette was a big blowhard, and so was Wayne Morse. I happen to think Wayne Morse was 100% right when he opposed in Vietnam. He was one of the, and people may not know this, but there were only two senators who voted against the Gulf Tonkin Resolution in 1964, which President Johnson used as a blank check. Wayne Morse and Ernest Gruening from Alaska, and their stories are quite interesting. Anyway, I've taken up my time.
Thank you. All right, Caesar, please tell us where you get your ideas, or why Cuban baseball. But I think you kind of touched on that earlier, though. Please.
Yeah, well, like I kind of alluded to about my dad sort of getting me started on this. But of course, at that time, when you're a kid, I was far more interested in the games I was watching on TV than any of the games that had happened in years past. But as I grew older, I started to appreciate the history of Major League Baseball and the importance of that. And as I started to appreciate that, I was able to start connecting the dots back to those players that my dad had talked to me about in Cuba. And as I grew older, sort of researching Cuba and Cuban baseball history was a way to reconnect with my family history, because I said it, we had left when I was 5 months old. I still haven't been back to Cuba. I'm desperate to go back there at some point. And so by writing about Cuban baseball history has been a real way for me to connect with my family history. And in fact, what I'm working on now for my next book, I hope, is my family's experience in Cuba and escaping after the revolution.
All right, thank you. Jim, where do you get your ideas?
Well, I think I'm a little different than a lot of writers. I think a lot of writers start with an idea and then research it. I start with research and then end up with the book. On my first book on Margaret Loughborough, I wrote an article for the Washington Post about the Confederate attack on Washington in 1864. And in the course of that, I came across this story about Margaret Loughborough, and I thought, oh, that's sort of interesting. I'd like to learn more about her and all this. And by the time I finished my research, I had enough for a book. So I went with the book. On my second book about the man who came on a slave ship, I was researching Margaret Loughborough at the Georgetown Public Library, and Yarrow Mahmoud's portrait is on the wall, and it says 1822. And Georgetown's lily white. And so I thought, gee, this is interesting. There's this black man who's got his portrait on the wall. And then I discovered he had a portrait by Charles Wilson Peale. And, it was 8 years before I went through just researching his life because I was so curious. But then finally, with my book on Murder, Inc. and the Kennedy administration, I was on the Senate Intelligence Committee as a staff lawyer, and we were investigating the Kennedy assassination. The committee had already looked into these plots to assassinate foreign leaders. So, and I had read the Warren Commission. So I thought it was sort of nonsense to look into the Kennedy assassination. I thought the Warren Commission had done everything right. And I brought in for the senators a witness from one of the intelligence agencies to talk about how foreign intelligence agencies would conduct an assassination. And this witness was talking about the KGB, which is the Soviet intelligence agency, and their assassination policies or operations. And I said a question that lawyers aren't supposed to ask. I said, isn't it true, Mr. Witness, that Lee Harvey Oswald was not the kind of man who would assassinate, who the Soviets would use as an assassin? And this guy said, oh no, Mr. Johnston, he was precisely the kind of man they use. And that just blew my mind. And he went on to say that during World War II, the Soviets were being driven back by the German army. And so they left assassins behind to kill German officers and saboteurs. And they discovered these were suicide missions and rational men wouldn't conduct them. So they looked for misfits and psychologically warped people, which is precisely what Lee Harvey Oswald was. So that's the way I sort of get my ideas. I get interested in something, I research it, and then I decide, oh, there's a book here.
All right, thank you. And I'm going to go to our chat because, Jim, there's a question specifically for you. Did you write the article in the Washington Post magazine on Yarrow Mahmoud?
Yes, I did.
I remember really enjoying that one. If so, I'm glad
Thank
you
you.
developed an entire book from it.
Thank you.
All right, Mary, please tell us where you get your ideas. Why were you inspired to write the books that you wrote?
Well, I've always been interested in aviation from elementary school when the TV was brought into the classroom to see Alan Shepard go off into space. But the thought that I have interviewed someone who grew up in Fairfax Station who told me about seeing the propeller of this man named Dr. Christmas who flew in 1908. First of all, I thought he made up the name. I had never heard anybody with the last name of Dr. Christmas, and there are a lot of Christmases in the North Carolina area. And like Jim in front of me, I started researching it. And the more I researched Dr. Christmas and everything that he was involved in, he's well known for building an airplane which had strutless wings, which means they weren't attached to the body of the plane, and the criticism of him, etc. I like to talk about him, and people said, you need to write a book. So that's how I got involved with writing about Dr. Christmas and early aviators. The second book for women, it's been my passion, I guess, because with my 7th grade students, how little I had time to talk about women with them. And so, as I said, I started researching. And one thing that just kind of stuck to me is that women were criticized for their accomplishments, but also for being out of the norm. Belva Lockwood, who was the first woman to run for president, actually be on the ballot, but also the first to ever talk before the Supreme Court, was criticized in the newspapers for having an adult tricycle that she used for transportation in DC. And I thought, this is what they're criticizing her for, not saying anything about her accomplishments. And another woman I ran into was Annie Peck. She was a lady after my own likes, because she said that she climbed the mountains in Andes and was one of the first women who did this. And she talked about the essential things that she had to have with her, and chocolate was one of those. But she was criticized for wearing man pants as she climbed those mountains. So again, she has an accomplishment that one or two other women had accomplished, but many men had not. And yet what they focus on is that she's wearing men's pants. So my book is organized by categories. So I had a friend who said, you could read this like an encyclopedia. So I have risk takers, I have reformers, I have scientists, I have inventors, aviators, etc. So you could pick up a section and read it and then put it down and come back and do it another time. So I enjoyed it. Since I've written it, I have 26 more women that should have been in the book. So who knows what I'll do next.
Well, that sounds like you're going to be working on another book. All right, Ed, please tell us, where do you get your ideas?
Well, I love to travel. I've been to ancient civilizations, historical sites in Cambodia, Angkor Wat, Cairo, Egypt, Belize, Guatemala, and I love the same thing in American cities, particularly in our capital city. And I find inspiration from poking around memorials, artifacts, personalities, and locales. To give you an example, my next book will be not on Lafayette Square, but on the Capitol building and Capitol Hill. And people have been to the Ulysses S. Grant Memorial. In researching that a bit, and just looking at the statues there, there's an amazing statue of Union cavalrymen charging. One of the Union cavalrymen has fallen off his horse and he's being trampled to death by his fellow soldiers. It's an incredible group sculpture. In my research, I found out that the man trampled to death, it was a self-portrait of the sculptor who had a nervous breakdown in completing this legendary work of the Grant Memorial, and immortalized himself as well underneath the hooves of Union horses. And then if you just go down a few yards, you find the statue of James Garfield, who was the second president assassinated after Abraham Lincoln. And he has an incredible story of his assassination just 6 blocks away, the old train station, which was actually on the National Mall at the time. And what I discovered was that the assassin shot him, but Garfield's doctors killed him because they didn't believe the new theories of the Pasteurs and of Jenner and of Lister about antiseptics and germ theory of disease. So his battery of 12 doctors inspected the wounded president with unwashed hands and with surgical instruments that hadn't been sterilized. And they spread terrible sepsis infections throughout his body. And then just a few yards from the Garfield statue, you have the Native American Museum, American Indian Museum. And in my research, I found that when the Smithsonian was excavating its foundation about 15 years ago, they found evidence of a grand party, a great party, porcelain, china, lobster tails, champagne corks, wine bottles. Was it a wealthy businessman? Was it a powerful congressman up the hill who owned a mansion there? Well, they went through real estate records and they found that the 2 women owned the mansion house right below the Capitol Hill. 2 women who had 11 female workers for them, who ran the most elegant brothel, house of prostitution in Washington at the time of the Civil War. So you just walking around, giving tours, exploring, you come upon all these hidden histories all around you in a place that is so laden with history.
Mary, I think you have 2 more women to add to your book.
It does sound like it.
All right, Denny, please tell us where you get your ideas.
Well, I pretty much answered that question, but I'll preface it this time by saying in my first book, that, you know, it was the letters, it was the stories and so forth. If I were to go forward with something else, it would have to do with travel. Because, and I've got a great title for it, Join the Band, See the World. But with all of the things that we've gotten to do with our groups and students over the years, plus our own initiatives, Jennifer and I, we've been in all 50 states, and we've been in 7 of the Canadian provinces, and we've been to a little over 30 countries. And there's lots still out there, and I just don't know. I mean, travelogues are dime a dozen. I don't know what the connective tissue right now would be, but maybe it would reveal itself over time. That it would have to involve music, and it would have to involve some kind of geographical connection, because that's been a common experience in our life, and that's all I have to say on that.
Well, music is everywhere. So I think
There
that
is.
would, yeah, I think that would be a good combination, travel and music.
So much of it has been written. I mean, it's just, there's so many great stories, but you know, you talk about John Philip Sousa, who quit his, disbanded his organization. They were making something like in 1914 dollars, he was making $4,000 a day, after paying all his bills and all his musicians and everything. And they did not have a Navy band at that time. And so he took the job when the United States was getting ready to deploy to the to World War I. He was the commander of the Navy band for $1 a year. And those kinds of stories are rife in the musical world, but they've mostly been told unless there's some other way of framing them or whatever. But yeah, you know, maybe one is enough. I don't know. We'll see.
All right, thank you. All right, so we will go to another question. What was one of the most surprising things that you learned in creating your books? So we'll take it. We'll ask Arthur.
Well, I'm not sure whether you're asking about the most surprising thing in production or little historical tidbits that say, gee, I didn't know that.
I think it could be either one.
Well, I'll come up with 2. One, the discovery that a number of the American commanders in the Spanish-American War had been Confederate generals. And this is like, you know, the Spanish-American War was 33 years after the end of the Civil War. In fact, Theodore Roosevelt, you know, a lot of Americans think Theodore Roosevelt was the commanding officer of all American troops in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. He was the commander of 1 regiment. He was in the cavalry division, which was commanded by Major General Joseph Wheeler, who had been a Confederate cavalry officer during the Civil War. And the other thing about the Spanish-American War is the great unification of the country in fighting Spain over Cuba also had an unfortunate connection to the beginnings or escalation of the Jim Crow era. You know, I don't think it's, you know, the fact that Plessy versus Ferguson is from around the same period is not an accident. The other thing, a fact that sort of surprised me was in my last book called The Peaceniks, about the various people that opposed the Russian war. I said that actually I went chronologically backwards. I started with Paul Wellstone in the Iraq War. I didn't realize that the vote in the Senate on the Gulf War in 1991 was much, much closer than the vote in 2002 that gave George W. Bush authority to, you know, topple Saddam Hussein. I think the vote was something like 53-47. There was a lot of opposition. In retrospect, a lot of people think that the Gulf War, the 1991 Gulf War, was the good war, and that the 2002 war was the big mistake. Paul Wellstone actually was against both of them, much to his credit.
Thank you. Caesar, I turn it over to you. What's the most surprising thing you've learned in creating your books?
Well, I guess probably the second book, Last Seasons in Havana, I sort of knew this, but then to actually see it in my research, as I'm researching sort of the political, what was going on politically in Cuba after the Castro Revolution was, you know, I think most people think that Castro came to power in in 1959, and the country overnight became a communist country. And it was really much more of a slow rolling conversion as he sort of slowly started dismantling whatever vestiges there were of democracy and capitalism. And in fact, in many ways, the professional baseball league in Cuba was really the last vestige of capitalism in Cuba. But just how long it took, probably it progressed over 2 years from 1959 to 61 before it was at least officially, Castro officially announced that it was a socialist revolution. It really was a kind of a slow rolling conversion.
All right, thank you. And Jim, please tell us one of the most surprising things you learned in creating your books.
I'm going to tell two things. One was in the research. I was researching the Yarrow Mammoet book, but actually I was researching that article that was in the Post, and the editor wanted me to try to find Yarrow's grave. His last name is Yarrow. And so I decided that he had lived up near Antietam, and so I went up there and I looked at a map and I found this street or road called Yarrowsburg Road. It's the only road in America that I know of that has the name of a man who came on a slave ship directly from Africa. And when I went up there, I ended up at an African-American church and was trying to get stories from people. And this woman came up to me, Gloria Dennis, and she said, "I'm not related to Yarrow, but my name is Turner and we're related to Nat Turner." And I thought, I've got the most fantastic story in the world. This little town of Yarrowsburg not only is connected with the famous Yarrow Mammoet, but it's also connected with Nat Turner, who led a slavery rebellion. And it turned out she wasn't right. The Turners had married Yarrow's son, and the Yarrowsburg came from his son's name and from his son's wife, who was the midwife. But the other surprising thing is how hard it is to get published. And I want to talk about that. With my Murder Inc. book, I queried over 60 publishers and agents trying to get that book published. And at one point, this is about the Kennedy assassination. And at one point, I found a literary agent who had said on her website that, she was really interested in the next big book on the Kennedy assassination. So I thought I had it made, and I, did the proposal and everything you do with an agent. And she wrote back and said, I don't think you're right. And I thought, wait a minute. I was on the Senate Intelligence Committee. I have recommendations from 2 former chairmen of the Senate Intelligence Committee that say it's a good book, but that's the difficulty of getting published.
Thank you. All right, Mary, please tell us about something surprising that you learned in creating your books.
Well, one is Dr. Christmas again. He is the inventor of ailerons. And anytime that you're on a plane and you see these little things at the end of the wings rising up and down, those are the ailerons. And he patented it and found out within a year or two after receiving the patent that the U.S. Army Air Corps had 15,000 American warplanes using ailerons and sued the government for patent infringement. And so my book tells a little bit about it and in detail, but he won his suit against the government. And he said in a congressional hearing, he was expecting millions. He got $100,000 from the government. But what was fascinating is that the Army queried every aviator they knew, French aviators, the Wright brothers, who invented the ailerons, because they did not want to have to pay Christmas anything. And they finally went out to the farm in Fairfax Station and talked to the farmhands who were still working there. They went and got a piece of metal and fashioned the ailerons as they would have looked like on the wings of the plane that he flew in 1908. And so that was amazing to me. The only other thing in researching women, this whole book started out with suffrage, and as researching all about suffragists, I found out in 1920 when women got the right to vote, there were still two groups that were disenfranchised. One were Native Americans, who were not considered citizens until 1924, and the others were Chinese American until 1943, did not get citizenship in the United States. And then, of course, poll taxes and literacy tests also disenfranchised them. So I learned a lot, and I wanted to share it and let people know about it.
Thank you. Ed, what's something surprising that you learned in creating your books?
Well, in my book about Lafayette Square, I came upon this inspiring story about the man for whom the park is named. The Marquis de Lafayette was responsible as much as anyone for America getting its independence, because he was the key liaison with our key ally in the revolution with France. Unfortunately, in his own life, Lafayette was never able to bring about a democratic republic, democracy in his own country. Napoleon shunned him. The kings that took power after the French Revolution's failure, they shunned him because they feared him. They knew he was a great revolutionary proponent of democracy. However, in his old age, he was invited for a reunion tour back to the United States. It was at that time in Washington, D.C., where he met his old friend from the Revolution, President James Monroe, who renamed President's Park Lafayette Square. During the same tour, he went up to Massachusetts. He met the 93-year-old John Adams from the Revolution, and he was invited to give the commencement speech to the Bunker Hill Battlefield Park from the American Revolution. He gave a wonderful speech, and then at the end, he did something very strange. He took big sacks, and he took a shovel, and he filled the sacks with earth from Bunker Hill Battlefield. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes, that battle from the American Revolution. He then took those sacks of earth with him back to France. 10 years later, he died, and he was buried in a Paris cemetery. A carriage rolled up. His son came out of the carriage, his son, George Washington Lafayette, and out of the carriage, he took out big sacks of earth. He took them to his father's grave, and he poured the earth over the coffin of Lafayette, who had been denied democracy in his own country throughout his life. But for all eternity, the Marquis de Lafayette looks up upon the soil of a free people, a people that he had helped to free. So I think that's an inspiring story about Lafayette Square.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you. All right, Denny, please tell us one of the most surprising things you learned in writing your book.
Well, danger. I think probably like most people, when I think of aviation in World War II, and by the way, Mary and I have to have lunch together sometime soon. There's too much in common here, especially where aircraft are concerned. But, you know, I think I had sort of the bias that probably comes from what the media covered. And that was the darlings of the World War II aviation in Europe, particularly were the fighters and the bombers. And I guess because my father's comments were so reticent, and because the letters told you nothing, I think that I thought, well, maybe it just. So in the deployment section of this book, I quoted General John Galvin, who ended up being commander-in-chief of the U.S. Command in the 1980s. And he referred to the growth of the Troop Carrier Command operation in just a sentence or two here. He said it required a special kind of warrior who charged through the sky in the thickest of the fighting and the place of most danger, flying not a fighter or a bomber, but a vulnerable transport aircraft, lightly armed, if at all, more often simply relying on surprise or darkness or whatever protection escorts could provide. Sometimes coming in at low levels, often climbing at the last minute to ensure enough height for parachutes to open at 500 feet or less, flying in tight formations on a straight line into the teeth of enemy fire, a gunner's perfect target in the sky, willing to pay the price, these pilots, in order to put the paratroopers where they had to go. And I never really heard it put that way before. So that's my surprise.
Thank you. I think Jim kind of touched on this a little bit, but what are the challenges of being an indie writer? But then on the flip side, what are the positives to being an indie writer? So Arthur?
Well, as Jim said, it's very difficult to get published or get attention from a publisher and agent, which is, why I've self-published, and I suspect the other panel members have. In terms of, I have gotten a few reviews. When I've gotten a favorable review, it's very rewarding. When I try to get a review and I don't, it's rather disappointing. And, the challenge in terms of writing is just, staying with the project, just pushing ahead. I've described it as like pushing a peanut ahead with your nose until it gets to where you want to go.
Because I know another writer mentioned that when you are with an agency, you have deadlines, and that kind of keeps you on track. So it sounds like when you're an indie author, you have to kind of manage your time.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you. All right, Caesar, please tell us challenges and positives to being an indie writer.
Well, yeah, getting published certainly is it. I had no idea how to get published or how to make any inroads in that direction. And I had been researching just Cuban baseball history because I was interested in it for probably a good 15 years, always saying, yeah, I'm going to write a book someday. I'm going to write a book someday. And I finally got to the point where I said, it's never going to happen. And I started a blog about Cuban baseball history, and I was convinced I'd be the only one who would ever read it. And if that was the case, that would be fine. That would be my outlet for all this material I gathered. And then one day I got an email from an old journalism professor asking me if I'd had a publisher for this material. And I said, no, why? Do you have one? And then when the email came back, yes, I was kind of stunned. I sort of sat there looking at it for like 5 minutes, like, am I really reading this right? But that's the only way that I ended up with a university press for that book, because otherwise it would have been just multiple blog posts that me and my then 500 followers or whatever it was on Tumblr would have seen. So yeah, and how do you even make inroads? Blind query letters and that sort of thing. It was sort of pretty daunting, and largely why I did a lot of research and not a lot of writing until I finally had something to motivate me to think that there was actually a light at the end of the tunnel where this would get published. And then, yeah, you really have to manage your time. Like I just sort of forced myself with a goal of, I'm going to write a chapter a month and try to stick with that as best you can.
All right, thank you. And Jim.
No, Renee, I think you got it correct that I've answered the question, although I did, and so I'll yield my time, except I want to back up what Caesar said, and that is that university presses are really, for writers, they are really the outlet because they care about what you say, not who you are.
Thank you. Mary, the challenges to being an indie writer, and are there any positives to being an indie writer?
Well, I love to research, and that's what I tell people. Writing, not so much. So it was the wonderful experience to do all the research. The hardest part for me was when to stop, because I just tell people history is like pulling a thread, and you just keep on going, and it's connected to everything else. And you've got to at some point say, I have enough. There's more to the story, but I'm going to tell this much now. I think one of the challenges for me, and this is just a private thing, was doing the index. I did it myself rather than trying to do it using a program or something like that. And once again, trying to think how somebody is reading your material and how they'd like to organize it and find the information in an index. That was a challenge for me.
All right, thank you. Ed, challenges and any positives to being an indie writer?
The great thing about independent publishing is anyone can be a published author, and not for much money. For a few $100s, you can go through Amazon or any number of services and get your book published. And it could be on any subject, a subject that mainline publishers shun. A big negative I found is marketing and promotion. There's nothing like having a real publishing house and a big publishing house or modest sized marketing, promoting your book. Unless you're a famous author, there's only so much you can do with social media or online seminars like this, or and so forth. I love to market and promote, but it's good to have a big brother behind you. So those are some of the pros and cons.
Thank you. All right, Denny, what about you? Challenges and any positives?
Well, 2 points make a line, and 2 books, I guess, make a point. I don't have that yet. My experience is entirely was serendipitous, and so I would be interested in doing something again. But the only thing I know is independent, and I really don't have a lot to say about it.
I know only Ed touched on this, but from my understanding, indie authors, you're doing marketing, promotion, you're designing the cover. So you don't only write, you have to look at every aspect of start to finish. Was that challenging? Anyone can unmute and answer.
Well, if you go through a publication service, you can actually hire, and it's recommended to, unless you're a very fine graphic artist, to hire an artist to do the book cover, which is a very important part of the book in terms of marketing. So you can, just about any book service, including indexing or editing, copy editing, fact checking, you can find freelancers or professionals to do that for you, or you can do it entirely yourself. Yeah, so there's a lot of play there.
Well,
Yes,
and
Jenny.
I had a best friend who I taught with, who became my editor. It's one of the best English teachers I know of, who was an editor. I also found it challenging to keep track of everything that I was working on. And I was just going to add a little bit of advice to keep a journal, and keep a journal of your sources, your illustrations, your questions, your paths of research, because sometimes I would get off on something and I thought, where did I find this information? And so just keeping a journal or list of those type of things, that it makes it all in one place to go back and look for.
And Denny, I think you were going to share something.
Oh, yes, I am. I have to make sure I got the right title. So that was one thing that maybe I stumbled onto something that worked pretty well. Military History reviewed the book when it was published, and they were very kind about the book. They particularly liked the cover, or the front cover. And I don't know if you can see it on this, and of course it's backwards, but it's the actual letters. And that was actually a lot of fun. I mean, I did that right here on this computer, and it stood the test of time. So maybe next time I'd get somebody who really knows what they're doing, but it was fun at least.
It looks pretty good to me. Arthur.
Yeah, I just have one suggestion. I discovered very late in the game with my last book, the read aloud function, which is a real godsend for proofreading, because it costs a lot of money actually to get a proofreader. The spell check doesn't pick up, if you have a word but it's a wrong word, it doesn't pick it up, and it's not very useful. But read aloud, and I do this with the stuff I write for work as well. You will hear when something isn't quite right. So it's really been a great improvement in proofreading my own work.
All right, thank you. All right, so we're gonna pause for a minute and look at our chat, because we have 2 questions, and I will ask them, and anyone feel free to answer. So one question from Ted is, how do you bring history to life in your books? Yes, Jim.
Well, I used a technique in Murder Inc. and I guess all of my books of sort of writing them as a novel. And with a novel, the structure is you have an overall arc of the whole narrative of the whole book. And then each chapter should be a mini little arc that has an opening, a story, and then a closing, and hopefully leads you to the next chapter. And that's called narrative history. And that's a technique I've used to write that.
I tried to personalize all my women with a quote from each one of them. And each quote was meaningful to their accomplishment and to their personality. And so it's like a little mini introduction as to who is this person and why did they say this.
Well, for me, and part of this is certainly my background in journalism, was the first person interviews with the various players who played in Cuba in the 40s and 50s, and having them tell their story in the story in the book that I'm writing. So tracking down the people who experienced the time period you're writing about, if that's possible, and getting them in their own words.
Yeah, I don't know if this is responsive to your question, but with my book Killed in Action about this fellow Steve Warner, I tried to track down everyone who'd had contact with him in Vietnam, college, law school, to get a perspective. I had his letters and what he reported, but I contacted a lot of people who knew him in Vietnam and what their recollections were.
Anyone else? How do you bring history to life in your books?
If I could say I use a technique called in media res, in the middle of things. I'll start for example, I'm writing a chapter right now for the Capitol Hill history book on the wildest election in American history, which was not 2020 or 2000. It was 1800, when Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, the killer of Alexander Hamilton, they deadlocked in the Electoral College through 35 ballots. And I start that story off with the delegate who was under the most pressure to decide, a man named James Baird of Delaware. He faced the prospect of civil war, of insurrection in the streets, if he didn't make the right decision on who to back. So I thought it was an exciting way to grab the reader's attention and then tell the whole story of that wild election year.
Wow, it's so funny. I just read about Burr and Jefferson and their duel. I just read about that earlier this week. I'm not sure why I ended up reading about it, but it was fascinating to me. So it's so funny to hear you mention
yes, Burr and Hamilton duel. Yes.
Oh, Hamilton. I'm sorry. I'm not Jefferson. Thank you for that correction. All right. Another question from our audience is, all of the panelists seem to write about things related to their background and experiences. When they read books by other authors or pursue hobbies other than writing, do they favor things that relate to the subjects of their books, or do they try new things outside of their areas of familiarity?
I've just been reading a book lately. I've had to read through dozens of books and hundreds of articles for the books on Lafayette Square and Capitol Hill. So I wanted to go a little bit further afield, while still feeding my love of history and travel. So I picked up a wonderful biography of Alexander Humboldt, who was sort of a precursor of Charles Darwin. He was a German scientist, explorer, who traveled throughout Latin America circa 1800. And he really invented, the book is called The Invention of Nature. And he really was the first to come up with how plants and animals match their topography, match their climate. And so it's a wonderful way to break away from what I normally read through, but still related to my subject matter.
Well, I'll put a plug in for the Fairfax County Library. I tend to browse at libraries rather than bookstores, and I just look for books that speak to me. And just two books I've read recently, one actually I just started, that have nothing to do with anything I've written about. One was a biography of Mohammed MBS, the current ruler, in fact, of Saudi Arabia, which I found fascinating. And right now I'm reading a book about Salim the Grim, who was Ottoman Sultan in the 1500s. And that's also something I know very little about the Ottoman Empire, but the book kind of spoke to me, and so far I found it very interesting.
All right, anyone else? All right, I have just a, yes, Jim.
Well, I'll do it on two levels. First, with the Yarrow Mammoth book, I knew nothing about Black history. And so when I got interested in this man, I had to learn everything about Black history. And then when I wrote the book, I decided that I think I wrote it for white people more than Black people, because I decided that most people were as ignorant as I am, or I was, about Black history. And so I tried to write the book as a story of race in America, and began it with Yarrow in Africa and how people got put on slave ships in Africa. And I also dealt with why slaves were brought here to do the tobacco crop in the area. I also want to compliment the Fairfax County Library, because even though I live in Maryland, I borrow books, especially audio books, from the Fairfax County Library. And I always stick with history, unfortunately.
Yeah, my dad was a history reader. He just read history and he was fascinated with religion. I read fiction. I don't really read nonfiction. So I want to follow up with that. How many of you read fiction books, or do you primarily read nonfiction, history?
Primarily nonfiction, but some good fictions. Sometimes historical fiction can tell a story better. War and Remembrance by Herman Wouk probably was as good a one-volume overview of the American time of World War II, though it is technically a work of fiction. By creating these family connections, it's a marvelous overview for someone who hadn't read anything about World War II. And its predecessor, Winds of War.
I read both, but I tell you what I'm missing out on is my metro time to read books, because that was when I was getting a lot of reading done. But I vary in primarily American history, because that is my background, and women history.
I generally stick with nonfiction, but every once in a while, I read a number of the books by James Clavell, particularly Shogun, which I found very interesting, because it actually is based on historical facts about this European sailor who became a advisor to the first Tokugawa shogun in about 1600. But generally I stick to nonfiction.
I guess I find myself mostly reading history, but I also like suspense and fiction as well.
I mostly read history, although Bernard Cornwell's novels on early England, the Saxon Chronicles, is excellent. It's much better than reading history is to read fiction.
So basically, you're all like my dad for the most part. He used to give me the hardest time because I don't read nonfiction, and I really should. All right, so we do have another question in our chat. This is for Arthur. Have you found from your research that inadequate or idealized memories of previous wars contributes to decisions to enter a new war?
That's a good question. I don't know. Well, I think they're different. Certainly, the World War I experience wasn't idealized. In fact, it in some ways paralyzed the United States in reacting to Hitler. Vietnam, I think, was, to some extent, a logical outgrowth of the Korean War. And I don't think it's any, talk about things I didn't know before I started researching. Dean Rusk, who was Secretary of State under Kennedy and one of the principal architects of the Vietnam War, had been the Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs during the Korean War. So I do think that, sometimes the experience, I guess, I don't know if the Korean War was a positive experience, but I guess we did preserve the freedom of South Korea. And I think that probably was somewhat of an influence on what we did in Vietnam a decade later.
Wars are very easy to start, but difficult to end. And there's many examples of that.
Correct.
In the Civil War, people thought that it would be, Northerners thought that it would be very easy to put down the South, the rebels very quickly, and vice versa was true. There were a few who dissented from that, General Sherman, Robert E. Lee. They knew the peoples of the North and South, that it would be a long and protracted conflict, which of course it was. In Washington, D.C., some said that the War of 1812, the U.S. could occupy Canada. It would be a mere walk in the woods. Instead, Washington, D.C. was burned down by a force of Royal Marines. So you can, World War I, a classic example.
Right.
Germans thought they'd be in Paris in a couple of weeks. It turned into 4 years of hell and then led to the Second World War. So that's one insight from wars.
All right, thank you. So we're almost at the conclusion of this event. I can't believe 90 minutes have come and gone. This time went by really quickly. But I want to end on, how can people buy your books? And do you have any last things that you would like to share? So we'll start with Arthur.
Well, I think all my books are available on, you can buy them through Amazon.com. A couple of them are available, by the Kindle. If you have Kindle, not all of them, but I think you can get a hard copy with almost anyone. I just would, if you don't order them directly from Amazon, if you go on their site, there will be a number of people selling them. My sales name is nmiles12, and I would ask people if they buy the book. One of the more infuriating things is when I've sent all my books out to reviews. I've had a few successes, but a lot of people who get the review copies obviously give them to secondhand booksellers who sell them on Amazon. They make money and the author makes nothing. And it's very frustrating. The other thing, you can order the books directly from me at amchan.cox, my last name .cox, and I'll give you a break on the price.
Arthur, can you put your email in the chat so that people can have that if they want to reach out to you directly?
Yeah.
All right.
I know how to do that.
Oh, well, if you don't mind, I'll share it. I'll pull it and share it for you.
Well, I'll do a Terry one.
Yeah. And Caesar, please tell us, how can people buy your books? And if you have any last things you would like to share with our audience?
It is both of the last seasons in Havana and Havana Hardball are available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And if you are interested in a signed copy, you can hit me up on Twitter. I'm at @Cbrioso, CBRIOSO, and if you send me a direct message, we'll work out the details.
All right. And Jim?
Same answer as everyone, is Amazon, but also, there's worldcat.org that tells you the closest library that has your book. And although we like to make money, I actually just also want people just to read the books. So the Fairfax County Library, I think, has most or all of my books, and you can use WorldCat to find it. But I also want to thank you for doing this. It's a good opportunity for independent authors to have talks and chat, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, and Mary, how can people buy your books, and any last words? Oops, unmute yourself.
Sorry. I have a website, and it's www.mlhbooks.com. And you can buy both of the book on aviation and on women. And just remember that this is the year that we're celebrating 100 years of suffrage. So www.mlhbooks.com.
And I just put that URL in the chat for everyone. All right, and Ed, how can people buy your books?
Well, one tip is that I have set up business sites for all my books, like the White House Unruly Neighborhood, and you can go there on Facebook and read free chapters, free sample sections from the book, similar to if you go to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and you hit click inside, and you can read some free sections of the book. It's like a teaser for someone. They can find out if they're interested in that, and then go ahead and purchase if they like.
All right, thank you. And Denny, how can people buy your book?
Oh, Amazon and Amazon Prime. It's called a softback, and it's very pricey because of its size and color. Kindle edition is $9. Then Barnes and Noble is the same for paperback and for their Nook book. Lulu Publishing, same thing. They call it paper book, and Lulu ebook. They're all the same price as as Amazon. I too, as someone said, I have books that I sell and send with, can be autographed or addressed to somebody at a reduced price with $2 shipping. And I'll put my email in the chat here while somebody else talks.
All right, wonderful. Thank you all so much, writers, for being a part of our panel and sharing your experiences. This was a wonderful event, and I'm so glad that you were able to be a part of it. I hope to see everyone tomorrow at 12:30 for our last author panel. Let's talk about children's books. You'll meet our panel of local authors as they discuss their books and journey as writers. And I just want to say, while I have you, since you all love history, we are offering a program on November 12th that is called Virtual World War Tour of Europe. And we have a writer that has basically interviewed a lot of World War II veterans, and she will share her experiences as she's written her books around this topic. So I did put into the chat the name of the presentation and a link that will take you to the library's event page so that you can register for that event. It is November 12th at 1 o'clock. So I hope that you can join us for that program. If you are interested in attending tomorrow's Let's Talk About Children's Books, registration has closed, but I have put my email in the chat. So if you want to reach out to me directly, I can send you the Zoom invitation to tomorrow's panel program. Once again, thank you all. I hope to see some of you tomorrow. Dear writers, thank you so much for being a part of this event. I hope everyone has a wonderful night.
Thank you,
Thank
Renee.
you.
That was wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.